Hello, Lisa. How you guys doing? On my way to work today, I tried to catch some fog, but I missed. That's your joke. Don't know what to tell you. Um, so for today, we're going to talk a little bit about the actual fighting in Vietnam, what that was like, what that looked like, um, and the beginnings of a disconnect in which the soldiers on the ground begin to question, the tactics, begin to question the mission. Um, but of course, people back home don't see that. They just, are supporting their troops. Um, that disconnect eventually will widen and fissure and will lead towards the anti-war movement, especially as some of those veterans come home and begin to feed that. Um, so that's what we'll talk about today. There's homework in which you get to read a manifesto from a student group called SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. Um, SDS kind of started as a civil rights organization, a bunch of college kids, and then it morphed into an anti-war organization as well. And then eventually these things actually become the same. That Vietnam is seen as a civil rights issue. Even Martin Luther King goes out there and he protests against the Vietnam War eventually. Uh, so that's what you guys have for today. I hope all is well. Enjoy your weekend, and yeah, stay safe, stay smart. Talk to you guys later. Hello. And so today we're going to kind of pick up the narrative now right after the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And so, of course, with the Tonkin Gulf resolution, this allows Lyndon Johnson to basically do whatever the heck he wants in Vietnam. And so immediately he initiates something called Operation Rolling Thunder. Um, the gentleman you see on your screen there is William Westmoreland. Westmoreland is the American military official in charge of U.S. operations in Vietnam. So this is his show. And initially, what Operation Rolling Thunder is a massive air campaign against North Vietnam. Um, and initially, this is very popular with the American people. It's seen as retaliatory for what North Vietnam did with the Tonkin Gulf incident. So the American public is supportive of this. There's a couple of problems, though, with this. North Vietnam does not have a robust economy. They don't have a lot of infrastructure, which means there's nothing to bomb. On top of that, Lyndon Johnson doesn't want to target civilians or civilian populations. So where there are factories, they happen to be like right next to schools and churches and things like that. So those then come right off the bombing list. So there's not many robust targets. You're not doing a ton of damage. And this is a problem. It's not eroding the effective fighting force of North Vietnam, and it's certainly doing nothing about the Viet Cong and their fighting in South Vietnam. So Westmoreland begins asking for more troops. And initially, this is all about, well, if we're going to launch an air campaign against the North, we need air bases. So we need to build air bases, and the air bases that are there, we need to make them bigger. And if we're going to build air bases, we need soldiers. And so Westmoreland begins asking for soldiers initially just to protect the air bases. But those soldiers, once you ask for like 50,000 Marines, the thought is those Marines then will begin working with the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, with ARVN, as they go out and they fight against the VC. And as Americans begin fighting with the South Vietnamese government's army, ARVN, they realize that ARVN is not a very good fighting force. They're not effective. They're not very good. They don't know what to do. And the Americans realize we just can't trust them to carry out these missions. So if you want a job done right, you do it yourself. And so ARVN, or the South Vietnamese military, is kind of pushed aside. And now Americans take more of the responsibility of the fighting on the ground. And this is an important kind of moment here, because initially, again, people are on board with this. But the longer you do this and the more casualties rack up, um, why are you doing it? Why are you fighting and South Vietnamese isn't fighting? Why are we in the middle of a civil war in Vietnam? It's Vietnamese versus Vietnamese, but yet we're the ones doing the fighting. We're the ones taking these casualties. This begins to fight to kind of like work here. And of course, the longer that ARVN is pushed aside, their effectiveness is just going to decrease. They're not going to get any better. They need more practice, right? And so the less you practice, the less you actually work, you're never going to get good. And so what happens now is this becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy, and to the point where the United States is never really going to be able to turn it back over to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. And so we're going to have to do the bulk of the fighting. And if we're going to have to do the bulk of the fighting, we're going to need even more soldiers. And so, what does this fighting look like? It's very different than what American military personnel were used to. This is not Korea. This is not World War II. This is not armies marching across territory. This isn't about gaining territory. This isn't about holding positions. These are small search and destroy missions. The enemy blends into the population. The enemy is not wearing a uniform. So, how do you tell the difference between a civilian and a member of the VC? How do you tell the difference between a North Vietnamese and a South Vietnamese? There's no way to do this. This causes much confusion. Added into it is that you will see that the VC infiltrate South Vietnamese government, South Vietnamese politics, and the South Vietnamese army. So sometimes the Americans, when they are fighting alongside the South Vietnamese, they can't trust the people they're fighting alongside. This, again, affects morale and affects fighting force. So the fighting conditions, these little search and destroy missions, basically small groups, small platoons of American soldiers, anywhere from 12 to 20 men, get on helicopters, they fly to a hill, they get off the helicopter, they patrol the jungles, they patrol that jungle for maybe a week, get back in a helicopter, fly back to base, have a week off, and then fly back basically to the same hill and do the same thing all over again. That also affects morale amongst your fighting force. Why do we keep going to the same places over and over and over again? And fighting in these jungles pose various problems as well, especially when your enemy is, well, they're familiar with the territory. So what you see on your screen here are two chemical agents that the U.S. military kind of comes up with. The first on the left there, you see that explosion, that is napalm. And napalm is a jelly-like substance that can be dropped from a plane or from a helicopter, mostly from planes. And the amazing thing about this product is that it combusts once it comes in contact with water. So when you're dealing with a dense jungle in the middle of a rainy season, these things just explode at the tree line. Once they get just past the tops of the trees and you get into that humidity, these things explode, and of course they burn the forest. Now, you've got civilians living in here as well. And of course, once a fire starts, the instinctive thing to do is to take water and try to douse it. Of course, the more water you put on one of these fires, the worse it becomes. And unfortunately, there are lots of incidents of civilians being hit with this chemical and being killed and severely disfigured. The image on the right, that is a pesticide that's being dropped from that helicopter. It's called Agent Orange, and it's a weed killer. It's highly effective. Again, it gets caught on the leaves, it kills the leaves, and it denudes the landscape. So it wipes out the jungle. So for both of these things, forget what the heck it's doing to the environment. The other thing with Agent Orange is that we found this out later, that Agent Orange is a carcinogen. In fact, so you had American soldiers who are, breathing this stuff in. This stuff is falling on them, and later on, we realized that this was causing cancer in a lot of our American veterans. So what you're seeing on the ground here is not translating back home. So soldiers on the ground begin questioning what it is, why are we doing what we're doing? And I've included a reading, a short reading, about a U.S. veteran reminiscing about what the heck was going on the ground. The American population back home, though, still supports the war effort, believes what we're doing is right, and they're hearing positive messages coming from Lyndon Johnson and coming from the Pentagon. So again, here's another disconnect. The guys on the ground, the guys who are doing the fighting, are beginning to question the mission. Why is it that we're here? What are we doing? And why are we, and if we're okay, if it's all right that we're here, why are we fighting the way we're fighting? And why shouldn't Arvin be doing the fighting instead of us? You have those questions beginning to seep in, but then you have the public where it's not quite happening yet. But what we'll see is that will begin to change, and you'll see the beginnings of an anti-war movement. And that anti-war movement is going to basically just kind of dovetail off of the civil rights movement. And then eventually it's going to become one and the same. And that this war is going to be seen also as a civil rights issue because the soldiers who are being asked to fight it predominantly are young men of color. Um, Rich white kids are not being sent to the jungles of Vietnam to fight. Um, it's inner city kids that are being sent to the jungles of Vietnam and fight. And likewise, they're the ones who are coming home as wounded or they're coming home killed. And so that anti-war movement begins to fester and is led by a group called um, called SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. And so for homework tonight, you get to read a little bit of their manifesto, which was written before the Vietnam War, but you'll see their view on democracy and their view on government in that reading.